Hey everyone, it's time for the next part of Goat in the Garden. If you remember, we ended the last section where Mandy met Lydia, Houdini's owner, and she had just told Lydia about how mad the men were where Houdini was eating the ivy on their land. In fact, she said he was purple in the face, fuming, and then he fell into the pond. And remember, Lydia said, "Oh my," and then they both burst out laughing. So she led Houdini into his pen, fed and watered him, gave him a final look over in case of damage, and led Mandy out of the barn. She bolted the door with care. "You see," she said to Mandy, "I do make an effort to stop his jaunts." There's an interesting word, jaunts. Do you know what that means? Remember, he keeps getting out. So if he jaunts, that's right. He gets out and runs around. Mandy wanted to know a lot more about the herd. "When do you milk the goats? How often?" "Is it difficult?" she asked in a rush. "Whoa," Lydia said, halfway across the yard toward the house. "Too many questions. You'd better come inside and let me make us a cup of tea." They opened the faded red door and stepped inside the house. It was like going through a time warp, stepping back into the past. There was no refrigerator, no stove, no washing machine. The cupboards were old and battered. Great beams supported the ceiling, and books crowded all the surfaces. Ooh, I love that. Shelves, windows, tables, even some had toppled onto the floor. Mandy sat down at a huge scrubbed table and watched Lydia poke at the embers of a fire in an old iron stove. She shook coal into the stove from a battered black bucket, tended the fire, and then went to fill a kettle at the shallow sink by the window. She set it on a rack that hung over the fire. Then she bustled about in a cupboard for cups and saucers. "No cake, I'm afraid," she apologized, as finally the tea arrived in chipped cups that didn't quite match the saucers. Mandy moved closer to the fire with her cup of tea, while Lydia explained the milking routine. Twice daily, summer and winter, 7 days a week in all weather. And of course, Lydia said, the milk is delicious. She went to a high cupboard and took out a clean jam jar. She dipped a ladle into a metal churn set on the windowsill over the sink and scooped out the creamy liquid. Carefully, she poured the milk and then turned the screw cap on the jar. "Here," she said to Mandy with a shy smile. "Take some home and try it." Mandy remembered home with a start. I mean, she jumped. She'd been so caught up in the herd of goats that she'd forgotten her dad. He must be just about ready to come looking for her and the goat. She jumped up. "May I phone my dad, please?" "I'm sorry, I don't have a phone," Lydia said. "No television, no radio. I do have running water and electricity," she said proudly. Mandy stared. She had never heard of anyone being able to manage without a radio, at least. "My father was maybe a bit old-fashioned about such things right up until he died," Lydia explained. "He didn't believe in modern gadgets. The old way was good enough. He lived in this house all his life, and he saw no reason to alter things." You know what alter means? That means change. That's right. Good guess. He, but he did like to have running water and the light at the flick of a switch, so he put in the pipes and so on. "And very glad I am, too." She sat by the fire, cozy and content. "But how do you make arrangements without a telephone? I mean, what if there's an emergency?" Lydia shook her head. "I don't have the need. Knock on wood. I live simply, as you see, and it suits me." She sat there in the middle of her flagstone kitchen floor in her rubber boots and old clothes. Mandy guessed that Lydia hadn't bought a single scrap of clothing for herself or a single teaspoon for the house for at least 10 years. "Well," Mandy said, caught up in the wonder of it all, "I'd better be going." She got up, but she could hear a car on its way up to High Cross. She recognized the sound of the car, its engine whining up the hill. That must be my dad now. At once the smile vanished from Lydia's face. It closed down, and a look of suspicion replaced it. He must have found High Cross on the map and guessed I'd be up here with Houdini, she explained. Come on, come and meet him. He's a veterinarian, you say? Lydia stacked the cups slowly in the stone sink. Yes, at Animal Ark in Welford. He runs the practice along with my mother. She shook her head. I generally don't hold with veterinarians. And here is a picture. Do you see her scooping the milk out? The goat milk out of the churn is what she called it, where she churns the milk, and then it can become butter if it's in a churn. Let's see what happens with Mandy's dad. Mandy read between the lines. Lydia had no money to pay vet's fees. She was quickly learning to pick up real meanings beneath Lydia's old-fashioned phrases. Oh, come on. He'd love to see the goats. He's a goat expert, she said proudly, and that was enough to break the shell of Lydia's shyness. They went out together to greet Mandy's father and her friend James Hunter at the ancient wooden gate. Dad! James! Houdini got impatient. He found his own way home. And this is Lydia Fawcett, and she runs a goat farm all by herself way up here, and she'd like to show you her goats. Wouldn't you, Lydia? And they're absolutely great. And Lydia, this is my dad and my friend James Hunter. James, what are you doing here? Mandy said, almost without pausing. Not so fast, Dr. Adams said. He politely shook hands with Lydia. James couldn't help staring at the odd woman, and he raised his eyebrows at Mandy. I'm sure Miss Fawcett doesn't want to be bothered, her dad said. Oh, no, not at all. You're welcome to see the goats, Lydia said. While the grown-ups went through the usual politeness, Mandy told James about High Cross. There's no television, no telephone, she whispered as they crossed the yard toward the barn. Isn't it great? James fixed his glasses more firmly on his nose. She could see he was about to disagree. What's great about no TV? There are books, Mandy said. Lydia had stacks of them, even in her kitchen, on the mantelpiece, over the stove, and alcoves everywhere. James just shook his head. They'd reached the barn now. Lydia went in and unlatched the door of the nearest pen. She let out a lovely black and white goat for Dr. Adam to see. She was medium-sized, sleek, with 2 white stripes down her face. Her beard was pure white. Dr. Adam ran an eye over her. He felt her silky coat and made murmuring sounds of approval. Do you know what murmuring is? This has lots of great words. Murmuring is kind of like when he talks quietly to himself. Lovely, he said. Lovely pedigree, lovely condition. You should show her this spring at the village fair. Oh no, Lydia said, overcome with modesty. I wouldn't think of doing that. Dr. Adam nodded quietly, peering into each pen. Nice, he said each time, or very nice. Mandy felt pleased as punch. She already felt proud of Lydia's goats. And you managed to kid them yourselves? He asked as he looked into the last pen. Lydia nodded. It's generally pretty straightforward. Well, if you ever need a hand, just give me a shout, he offered. Lydia withdrew half a step and put on a slightly more formal tone. That's very kind of you, she said, but I think I shall manage. Well, Dr. Adams insisted, if you ever need anything, we're just down in the village. Dad, Mandy cut in. Things were getting awkward. Her father didn't understand that Lydia had no money and was too proud to mention it. Lydia was looking more withdrawn. She drew herself together with great dignity inside her shabby brown jacket. I thank you, she said, very stiff, very distant. But I don't need anything. As I was saying, I've lived here all my life, Dr. Hope, and I've never had to rely on help or advice. I run my little herd very happily by myself. Thank you. Mandy put a hand on her dad's shoulder, ready to make a quiet, quick exit. But Lydia hadn't finished. She raised her chin, squared her shoulders. I ask very little, she said in a clear, firm tone, ignoring Mandy now, but I do ask one thing, and that is to be left alone. And with that, she showed them out of the barn, down the cobbled path. She stood at the gate and watched them climb into the car. Mandy cringed as her dad went back for a final word. She rolled down the window to listen. By the way, he said in his usual straightforward self, I did mean to mention one thing. It's about Houdini. Well, Lydia said, still suspicious. Well, Sam Western's in a rage about the state of his garden, and you know what he's like. He paused. It's not the first time old Houdini's made a mess of his flower beds, apparently. Lydia met his gaze with a steely stare. That means she just kind of looked at him and she didn't flinch, she didn't blink. Anyway, he's throwing his weight around, saying he'll take definite action next time. Silence. Lydia made no move. She didn't even blink. I'm just mentioning it. If I were you, I'd keep the wonder a bit more secure, just in case. You're not me, Dr. Hope, Lydia said at last. She rammed the loop of rope firmly over the gatepost. Mandy waved, but Lydia ignored her again as Dr. Adam climbed in the car and started downhill toward the road. What did I say? Mandy's dad asked, scratching his beard. What made her go off like that? Mandy had an idea, but she couldn't tell him. It had hurt Lydia's pride, that offer of help. Vets cost money. The drugs and the x-rays are expensive. There's no way Lydia could afford to take her father up on his offer. Oh, nothing, Dad, she said. Dr. Adam frowned. One peculiar lady, he said. Another great word, peculiar. That kind of just means strange or odd. No, she's not, Mandy snapped. She felt sad and she felt confused. Why was she angry with her own father? The three of them sat in silence all the way home. Ooh, so now we know about Lydia. It seemed like she was really friendly with Mandy, but then things kind of took a turn for the worse. The next chapter is just chapter 3, but look at the picture. Can you see what that is? At first glance, you might think salt and pepper shakers, but that's not what they are. Those are big canisters for milk. I wonder what's going to happen next. Do you have an idea? Do you think Mandy will go back to the farm and visit Lydia, or will she stay away and give Lydia her privacy? You have to join in tomorrow for the next part of Goat in the Garden.